going to start off with another funny video. I have two funny videos for you guys today. And so they're from Futurama, as you saw from the climate change one. So let's watch this quick video about garbage. And it'll really sort of set the stage for today's class. So let's watch this.
Ah, just as I thought. The answer lies in this movie I found on the internet. New York City, the year 2000, the most wasteful society in the history of the galaxy. And it was running out of places to bury its never-ending output of garbage. The landfills were full. New Jersey was full. And so, under cover of darkness, the city put its garbage out to sea on the world's largest barge. The repulsive barge circled the oceans for 50 years, but no country would accept it, not even that really filthy one. You know the one I mean. Finally, in 2052, the city used its mob connections to obtain a rocket and launch the garbage into outer space. Some experts claimed the ball might return to Earth someday, but their concerns were dismissed as depressing. Wow, you got...
All right. So, little piece of satire, obviously, but an accurate piece of satire, because today we're going to be focusing on waste. And the clip really does it quite well. We don't handle our waste well. We look for short-term solutions. We look for ineffective solutions surrounding the way we handle our waste. And, that clip was obviously from the early 2000s. So, it's talking about, 2000 being a very wasteful society, but it really still applies in 2021. We're still an extremely wasteful society. We have no great solutions for what to do with our trash. And as you sort of saw in the climate change lecture, our food waste as a type of trash contributes significant amounts of carbon dioxide and methane to the atmosphere. So clearly something's broken in our trash system, not just here, but globally. We saw that with the food waste problem and climate change. We saw that with the microplastics, right? How many billions of pounds of plastic are in the ocean. So let's talk about waste. Let's talk about the different types of waste. Let's talk about how we process and handle waste, and all the things surrounding waste as a concept. So the title of today's talk is the case of this suicidal cats and the problem of waste. And it's a kind of a fancy title. I guess, I don't know, maybe it's kind of like an attention grabbing title because you think suicide cats, you think, wow, that sounds crazy. I didn't know cats could commit suicide, and you'll see why cats are committing suicide. So we'll start off with this picture. You guys probably recognize, or at least some of you probably recognize this guy with his really bulbous nose and his sweet hat. So this is the Mad Hatter. You probably know him from, this is Disney, but you're thinking Alice in Wonderland, right? So this kind of quirky character, Mad Hatter, keep him in the back of your mind. And if you know the answer, if you know all about why he's called the Mad Hatter, keep it yourself. Don't spoil others. We'll talk about that in just a moment when we sort of get through the tale of the suicidal cat. So let's jump in. So the tale of the suicidal cat starts in actually Minamata. It's a fishing village. Well, at least historically it was fishing village on Japan. So you can see it's Yatoshiro. You can never say that right. Sea, just off Japan. Now, in the 1900s, or very early 1900s, Minamata was relatively poor. It was primarily reliant on fishing in the neighboring seas. In particular, there's a little bay here called Minamata Bay. Now, in 1908, a company called the Jiso Corporation, I don't know if that's how you say their name, but that's how I've always said it. They opened a factory, a chemical plant in Minamata in 1908. Now, they originally started by trying to produce synthetic fertilizers, but eventually they actually started off and branched off into producing a compound called acetyl aldehyde. Now, acetyl aldehyde, we didn't really talk about it during the lecture about plastics, but it is commonly used to make plastics as well as synthetic glues. There are different types of glues, like some glues are synthetic and some are natural. Like you can make glues from like horses and stuff like that. So I guess those would technically be natural glues. But acetaldehyde is used to make synthetic glues. You could think of things like super glue that uses acetaldehyde to make. Now, fast forward about 20-something years after the Chizo Corporation started its little factory in Minamata. It was producing about 210 tons of acetaldehyde per year. That might not seem like a lot, but for 1932 times, that was quite a bit, right? I mean, modern factories produce way more than this, but for the 1930s, that's a lot of production. Then, sort of by 1951, so about 20 years later, they actually jumped to about 6,000 tons of acetaldehyde per year. Now, the not so fun thing about the production of acetaldehyde as a compound is you actually require mercury. Now, mercury is one of the naturally occurring elements on the planet. It is what we would define as a heavy metal, very much like lead or zinc or copper or gold. These are just heavy metals that, heavy as in like actual weight. That's why they're called heavy metals. There's things called light metals as well. You guys probably don't know this, but like things like lithium, which is in batteries, is called a light metal. But mercury is a classification of what we call heavy metals because again, just they're massive. Like they have a lot of mass to them. Now, mercury is a very, very interesting compound. It's liquid at room temperature. So you guys probably aren't old enough to have experienced this, but thermometers, or maybe they still have them around. I don't feel like they do, but there might be some kicking around in older doctors' offices. But thermometers used to use mercury and its liquid form to take your temperature. Now it's replaced by alcohol. But mercury is pretty cool. It has a lot of awesome properties for manufacturing and electronics and stuff like that. But the thing about mercury is that, and like all heavy metals, mercury is toxic. That's really the only way to say it. But the thing about mercury is actually how toxic it can get over time. Now, if you were to chug a bottle of liquid mercury, you get sick for a little bit and you'd eventually recover. And so if you just chugged garden variety mercury, liquid mercury like this, like there was in a thermometer, you'd be okay. It wouldn't do too much damage because regular garden variety mercury, not so good. Not so good for you, but not super toxic. However, when mercury makes it from an industrial plant, such as the Chizo Corporation's plant, into the environment, there's an entire group of microorganisms, those crafty little buggers, that actually convert this type of mercury into a type of mercury called methyl mercury. You don't need to know what that looks like. Just know that there's different types of mercury, as there's most metals out there. So regular mercury, toxic, but not super toxic. But once bacteria get their grubby little hands on it and convert it to methyl mercury, it becomes extremely toxic. It becomes what we call an organic compound, and it easily seeps into your skin, easily goes into your tissues and your fat, and it just wreaks havoc on your system. So garden variety mercury, not so good, but survivable. Methyl mercury, very, very toxic. And then the final thing I'll make mention of, one of the other common forms of mercury that we see is called ethyl mercury. So just drop the M from methyl mercury, ethyl mercury. It's one of the most common ways we see ethyl mercury, and you guys have probably heard this name before, is actually a pharmaceutical compound called thimerosal. Ethyl mercury is not toxic at all. It's very, very minimally toxic. It takes large amounts of ethyl mercury to actually cause harm. So just as a note, regular garden variety mercury, toxic, but not super toxic. Methyl mercury, very, very toxic. Ethyl mercury, significantly less toxic, about as toxic as regular mercury. So just wanted to point that out. A lot of people say that ethyl mercury, i.e. thimerosal found in vaccines, is really dangerous. It actually just simply isn't. If it was methyl mercury in vaccines, it would be super dangerous. But it's ethyl mercury, so it's not dangerous at all. So just wanted to make mention of that. We're talking about mercury. It bears mentioning, talking about some scientific inaccuracies you see in average everyday life. Now, 1951, 6,000 tons of acetaldehyde per year. 4 years later, they started seeing some really odd things happening to local animals. And this is where the case of the suicide cats pops in. And so you would see cats like this. So this is just a little handy dandy picture. Well, not a handy dandy picture, but it's a picture of what some of the cats are doing. They kind of look like scaredy cats, right? But they're essentially contracting, right? They're forming like an arch with their back, right? And cats would do this. They experienced some really weird neurological behavior, and people were reporting that cats were like killing themselves. They were jumping off like bridges, drowning themselves, things like that. People were also reporting that dogs were disappearing. They were just couldn't find their dogs, and their dogs would just wander off. They were noticing that birds were just falling dead from the sky. And they were finding massive fish kills. And within these fish kills, they were actually pulling fish with some pretty severe deformities, including multiple heads, multiple sets of fins, all sorts of weird things. Now, you can imagine in 1955, this is pretty perplexing, right? I mean, you know, you're talking about close to 80 years ago, right? So this is back in 1955, this is pretty perplexing, but I think you guys probably already know what's going on, right? Acetyl aldehyde, mercury, bad things are happening. So I think you guys probably already made the link in your head, but they didn't at the time. And that's just a function of where science was at the time. And so fast forward a year later, in 1956, a 5-year-old girl was actually examined at the Chiso Factory Hospital in Minamata. She had suffered some pretty severe neurological symptoms, difficulty walking, speaking, convulsions. And the doctors, unsurprisingly, back in 1955, where they were recommending smoking as a healthy thing to do, did not realize what the heck was going on. They didn't put 2 and 2 together, like I'm sure you guys already have. In addition, they found 8 other girls experiencing the same set of problems. Now, they originally thought this was some sort of toxin, some sort of microorganism, like a bacteria or a virus. So what they did is they isolated those girls because they thought it was contagious. By later that year, so about 5 or 6 months later, they had about 40 patients in total, and of this what we call Minamata disease. That's what they were calling it because they thought it was a disease, and obviously nothing to do with the factory. And of the 40 patients that have been identified, 14 had died. So you're talking about a mortality rate around 30%, which is really high, especially if you think it's a pathogen, right? So this brings us to the question, what's happening? And again, I'm pretty sure you guys already know what's happening. I've never had a class that didn't figure out what was happening right away because it's blatantly obvious, right? A chemical factory producing waste, and this is 1955, right? Where smoking was considered a healthy thing, right? So they were just taking that toxic waste and they were dumping it into Minamata Bay. And that toxic waste was filled with mercury. And as we talked about in the plastics lab, once a toxin makes into the environment, it starts to biomagnify and bioaccumulate up the food chain. And if humans are eating the fish, as the people of Minamata were doing, they eventually start to pick up more and more of this toxic material and more of this mercury, right? And so that's why I say it's probably pretty obvious to you guys, right? Toxic chemical makes its way into the food chain, as we talked about with bioaccumulation. And because humans eat at the top of the food chain generally, they're getting heavy doses of these chemicals. And so really sort of nice case, right, of how pollution and how we handle waste affects human beings. So let's talk a little bit more about Minamata. Now, they took hair samples of victims and the residents, and they actually found that the maximum level of mercury that they were detecting was 705 parts per million. And when they compared that to people not living in Minamata, that was about 4 parts per million. Now, that might seem like a lot of mercury, but the reality is mercury, as with other heavy metals, arsenic, lead, they're naturally found in soil. So you always have a background consumption of these heavy metals. It's just the way it is. It's not like anything intrinsic about the way we grow food nowadays. It's just these heavy metals are just really abundant in soil where we obviously grow our crops. If the crops are growing in the soil, they're obviously going to pick up some of these heavy metals. So don't let this 4 parts per million frighten you at all. It is a very, very low level, especially relative to some higher doses of 700. So, for instance, if you tested your hair right now, you would find mercury in your hair, you would find lead, you would find arsenic. And again, it's nothing about anything bad. It's just a naturally occurring thing in our soil. It's kind of a terrible thing, but just sort of the way things have always been. But the problem with these things is what happens when they get in high concentrations, right? 4 parts per million is nothing. Anything over typically 100 parts per million is considered toxic. So it's usually a dosage thing. Dosages are kind of a big deal in medicine, right? Too much of something is bad, right? Too little of something generally doesn't mean there's any harm. So that was what we were seeing in Minamata. Now, what were some of the symptoms, right? They were experiencing muscle weakness, and these are all neurological things, right? Damage to hearing, vision, speech. Muscle weakness obviously is neurological, crippling hands and feet, paralysis, eventually coma, and then death. So lots and lots of neurological disease symptoms, all stemming from the poisoning of via methyl mercury. What methyl mercury does, unlike, well, to an extent the way regular mercury does, it actually likes to bind to your neurons, so the parts of your brain that are firing chemical signals. It binds to your neurons and basically wreaks havoc on your neurons, which is why when we see heavy metal poisoning, such as from mercury, it's really commonly has a series of things we categorize with mental dysfunction. I'll use that. So that's what we were seeing for symptoms. And grand total, there was about 3,000 cases of methyl mercury poisoning or Minamata disease, with 1,800 confirmed deaths, which is really high. If you think about that, that's close to 2/3, right? So close to, it's about 50% of people died almost, right? Or over 50% of people have died, which is a really high, fatality rate, right? For anything. And so I didn't put these pictures up right away because they're really awful, but you can sort of see some of the things that people are experiencing, right? Pretty severe cramping of their hands, extreme weight loss in children, paralysis, and severe mental things. So I'm going to skip off those pictures because they're kind of terrible to look at. But that was Minamata, so pretty serious disease with a really easy to understand source. Now, they didn't quite understand it at the time, but back in the day, it was really a mystery. Now, eventually Japan got its act together, which I guess it's not really that surprising. Japan's a pretty smart nation of folk. And by 1970, Japan had enacted their water pollution control law, and it basically enforced the control of discharge of all types, not just commercial, but also residential and industrial, into the bodies of water in and around Japan in relation to what we would call toxic substances. In addition, because of how bad things got in Minamata and how much Minamata depended on the ocean, so their Minamata Bay for sustenance in the economy, they actually enacted the Minamata Restoration Act, which basically allowed them to dig out all the sediment from the bottom of Minamata Bay. So they basically dredged it, and they basically got rid of all that disgusting contaminated soil at the bottom of the bay, and eventually led to mercury concentrations dropping down to about 4.6 parts per million, so at an acceptable level. So Minamata, what is an example of? Well, Minamata is a sort of a mismanagement. Well, actually, I wouldn't say mismanagement. It was a purposeful management because they were just dumping into the ocean without any rhyme or reason, right? I would say mismanagement probably better characterized as like, I didn't know, or like I did it on accident. So, but a poor management of their wastewater, and their wastewater is chock full of mercury, and it was what we called a point source of pollution. Now, this idea has come up before. We've talked about point source solutions before, and what that really tells us is we know exactly where it's coming from, right? The mercury, the toxic sludge, was coming from a single factory. Thus, we knew exactly where it was coming from, and we could shut that source off and potentially fix the problem. Now, mercury is what we would call a hazardous waste. Now, a hazardous waste encompasses a lot of different things. There's lots of things that are hazardous and that you might not even know are hazardous. For instance, gasoline, what we put in our cars and drive, right? What propels our lives forward. That is technically a hazardous substance. Lots of things are hazardous substances, even if you didn't think that they're hazardous. But the way we define hazardous substances is anything that poses a threat to humans or the environment because it's poisonous, dangerously chemically reactive, corrosive, or potentially flammable. And again, this is a wide variety of things, including radioactive waste, sludge, and ash from incinerators, coal burning plants, industrial solvents, medical waste, car batteries, and the list goes on and on and on and on and on and on. It's really long. It would take me a long time to talk about all the things. So Minamata is a hazardous waste. That's what we're seeing. And when we think about the sources of hazardous waste globally, actually 80 to 90% of them come from developed countries. So you're thinking about the EU, China, and the United States. We produce 80 to 90, and Australia and Russia. We produce 80 to 90% of all hazardous waste, and the United States unfortunately and unsurprisingly produces the highest volume of hazardous waste in the world. And that's just the way we are. So this brings us back to our friend that we started off. We have our friend, the Mad Hatter. And for those of you that have never really thought about why he's called the Mad Hatter, well, he's crazy, clearly. You know, and I say crazy, and I don't mean to be demeaning to people that have a struggle with mental disorders, but he's a character that's just portrayed sillily as kind of crazy. Now, why is Mad as the Hatter? Why is he crazy? Well, he's a hatter. Now, a hatter produces hats, as you can imagine. Now, the idea of man as a hatter, it stems from our friends over in England, and basically referred to anyone suffering from some level of insanity. And so when people were making hats way back in the day, they actually use mercury, so liquid mercury, to help make hats softer. Now, one of the ways they make hats is they heat those hats up and they add the mercury, and it makes them softer and easier and more pliable to sort of mold into the shape of the hat they want. And as they do that, the mercury gets aerosolized. It gets put into a gaseous form. And you can imagine if you're a hatter and you're making hats every day for your entire life, you're breathing in large amounts of mercury, gaseous mercury. And so you breathe it in. And as you breathe in more and more and more, it starts to cause symptoms of mini-motta disease, right? You start to see severe neurological issues, right? Muscle weakness. But one of the other thing does is when mercury is inhaled nasally, it actually commonly gets into your brain much faster, causing some severe neurological symptoms and what historically we would describe as insanity or someone being crazy. But the idea is people are just suffering from some change in their mental state as a result of poisoning. So if you ever wonder why Mad as a Hatter is a thing, it's because of our friends using mercury to make hats. They were making the ultimate sacrifice so that men of the time could look as cool as the Mad Hatter does. So if you didn't learn anything today, I hope that's the one thing you learned, because I always think that's a fun little piece of trivia about mercury poisoning. So anyways, so hazardous waste is clearly a part of our average everyday life. It's a lot. You don't really sort of think about the hazardous waste that you generate, but anything you buy that's made from plastics, or you buy electronic devices, food, you buy, say a coffee maker, they all produce some level of hazardous waste. So what the heck do we do with this broad category of hazardous waste? Well, there's a couple ways that we do this. So I think probably the three coolest ways. The first is bioremediation, where we use our microscopic organisms and the enzymes, or potentially just the enzymes that they produce, and we use them to detoxify and break down hazardous substances. A really, really awesome an effective way to do that. Now, for instance, for those of you that have ever been into the Boston, Boston proper, down by, say, like the seaport, or maybe down by the aquarium, if you look out into the bay, you see those, 8, I think, giant white eggs in Boston Harbor. Now, for those of you that never really thought what those are just giant, what we call bioreactors, and they are chock full of poo-poo and pee-pee. But poo-poo and pee-pee is just a type of hazardous waste. And inside those giant eggs, they have all sorts of bacteria that are performing bioremediation. And so wastewater treatment plants commonly employ bacteria as well as other types of microorganisms to break down gross hazardous material. So that's our friend bioremediation, accomplished by our microorganisms, the ever resilient soldiers of the planet, I would argue. And then we have phytoremediation, which is a pretty cool technique where you use plants and algae to essentially pull pollutants from soils and waters. The reality is plants are basically pollution sponges. As they sit in the soil, they indiscriminately pull in water from the soil, and metals and hazardous substances are often found inside the water and soil. So plants basically just pull them in, taking those hazardous materials out of the water in the soil. So really cool little technique. And then probably the coolest thing, and for those of you that had a chance to watch Plastic Ocean, you've already heard about this one, but the United States Navy has this crazy technique called plasma gasification, where they basically use high energy to basically vaporize trash. And it can be trash like hazardous waste. It could be solid waste, which we'll talk about in a moment. It could be plastic, any type of waste. They heat it up to crazy temperatures and it basically turns to dust, reducing the volume of their waste by 99%. So like if you had a 2-liter bottle, just picture like plasma gasification would take that 2-liter bottle and basically make it into the size of a penny, basically, which is kind of a cool thing to think about. But the sort of the final thing I'll make mention of, bioremediation and phytoremediation are really common. Plasma gasification only really exists in the United States Navy at this given time, which is kind of unfortunate. Now, other ways we take care of hazardous waste are much more common than these three, which are physical methods where we use like some sort of filter like charcoal or resin, or distillation or encapsulation and storage to essentially take these toxins, this hazardous waste out of the environment, out of our factories and stuff like that, and trying to store it safely. Oftentimes, some factories, and this is not that common, but it does occur across the planet, they'll try to chemically convert this hazardous material into something less toxic, so that if it gets out, it's less damaging than, say, if it got out full strength. So those are two common ways as well. But the reality is, and this probably shouldn't surprise you, is that the most common thing done is we stick it underground. Land burial is by far the most common way we handle hazardous waste on this planet. And that really shouldn't surprise you, right? Why is land burial the most common way? Well, just think about how easy it is to dig a hole and throw stuff in it, especially if you have a giant tractor, right? It's super easy to do, right? It's super cheap and is commonly used across, Europe, the United States, China, Russia, everywhere it's used, because it's cheap and easy to do. You dig a hole, or you do something slightly fancier. You stick your solid waste in there, you cover it back up, and you forget about it. And that's easy to do. And you guys probably know that's probably a bad thing, right? Just sticking stuff in the ground and forgetting about it is a bad thing. And you'd be absolutely right, right? So these ideas are grossly imperfect, right? They're really imperfect. Now when they try to do land burial, they try to put them away from aquifers and underground water sources, but leaks are really common. And people digging up things is really common, especially as these wastes were buried sometimes decades ago. But the other problem with hazardous waste, and this ties back to our idea of sustainability, is because it's so cheap and easy to do, it really encourages businesses to not really think about trying to make less hazardous waste. And so it does encourage the production of hazardous waste. Now, one of the sort of ways we commonly see, so this is actually just a really nice little figure. I don't know. I've had this figure for years. I don't remember where I got it from. It says Sengage learning, but I don't know what the hell that is. So one of the common things we see is, and we'll talk about this idea in a moment, is we have factories. They have these little drainage pools where they store their toxins. Clearly a bad thing, which we'll talk about in a second. But we have landfills which bury hazardous waste, and you can imagine, again, an imperfect solution. It's out of sight, out of mind. But if you have an aquifer, any toxic material has the potential to leach out from your landfill, i.e. your buried hazardous waste, and get into aquifers. And as we discussed, if it makes it into aquifers, it oftentimes makes it into well water, right? It makes it into lakes and streams and stuff like that, getting out into the environment as a whole. Now, one of the coolest things they actually do is actually what are called hazardous waste injection wells, where they dig these really long tunnels down into the ground. They can vary in length. Sometimes they're miles, but generally they're not that deep. And what they do is they dig these giant tunnels, they put this piping in, they try to get down to empty aquifers. And so they pump the hazardous waste down into these deep aquifers. But as I've mentioned with the landfills, leakages are common, but it is still out of mind and out of sight. And the reality is, even these large injection wells are still cheaper than trying to figure out a way to handle our waste. Now, as I mentioned, our factories here, they commonly employ surface impoundments to handle their hazardous waste. And so these commonly are, and they should be, as per federal law here in the United States, but this clearly varies depending on where you are in the world. These surface impoundments should be double lined with very, very thick plastic material to essentially keep these toxins that they're pumping into here from getting, seeping through and into the environment. But the reality is, when they actually survey these things, and when the EPA surveys these things and other agencies within our government, the reality is they find that about 70% are unlined. So they're just pools in the middle of the desert or in the middle of a town that are just accumulating toxic materials over time, potentially leaking out into the environment. And so that's a really common way, surface impoundments. If you ever see, like by a factory, if you ever see a little pond, don't go into it. Don't try to get anything from it. It's probably a surface impoundment. Now, what happens with these surface impoundments is a couple things. Now, the toxins typically settle to the bottom and they become very, very concentrated. As you can imagine, these are small. I mean, they could be large ponds, but they're not super deep like a lake or anything like that. And so water evaporates from these ponds, causing the toxins to become more concentrated, which is clearly not a good thing. And sometimes if they're uncovered long enough, the toxic compounds start to evaporate themselves, and those compounds get into the air and they come down via rain. So clearly not a good thing either. And then the other big issue is in areas where rain is quite abundant, maybe not in the desert here, but certainly in places like Massachusetts or Oregon or any place that gets a decent amount of rain. Overflow during a storms are a big deal, right? So if you have a large amount of storm water comes through, pulls these toxins out, leaks them out into the environment. We saw the same thing happen in Texas, for instance, during Hurricane Harvey. There was big leaks of surface impoundments due to the heavy storms from storm surge from Hurricane Harvey. Posed a really big issue in Texas. We saw a similar thing almost happen in our friends down in Florida, where oh crap, I'm sorry. There's a case that recently happened in Florida that failed to happen, so it was a good thing. But these are very much like land burial, imperfect. And then probably the most perfect way to store hazardous waste is in drums, buried and monitored. Not like this, obviously. This looks, like something out of a apocalyptic video game or movie, but storing things in properly sealed and properly constructed drums like this is really good. It's really effective, but it's very, very expensive. You can imagine if you have a drum, 55-gallon drum like this that can store, say, nuclear waste, it's probably very expensive to produce, and you would be absolutely right. So this is great. It's very effective, but not very common and very, very expensive, which is why it's obviously not common. Now, we like to sort of think about scenes like this as being essentially, not something we see in Massachusetts, but I like this map from Boston University because it really shows that this problem, right? This is not just a industrial Midwest problem, right? This is not just like, I don't know, any other place where it's heavily industrialized, right? It's not a China problem or something like that, right? This is in every state in the United States problem. And so we can look at this sort of grouping of sites here. Now they're concentrated, as you'll probably notice, pretty heavily around the large cities. So Worcester, Springfield, and Boston metropolitan area. But you'll notice we have a couple different things. Now we have national priority lists. There's 36 of them spread across the United States. These are basically like, you could consider them like Superfund sites, where they're extremely toxic chemicals that require large intervention by the federal government and funding from the federal government to deal with. So there's some serious chemical. And notice they're spread across the entire state. Pretty heavily concentrated over here, because that's where most of our population is concentrated, right? Then we have what we call large quantity hazardous waste generators here in blue. And you also notice there's some black here, which are solid waste incinerators, where they burn waste. We'll talk about that later. And then we have a bunch of different hazardous sites in red and orange, and then we have landfills in green and yellow, again spread across the state. So basically, you'll notice every single town, every single county in Boston, in Massachusetts, has some sort of landfill. Most of them are capped, but actually about 50-50 are capped versus uncapped, I should say. So, and I want you to think that scenes like this don't exist in Massachusetts, because they certainly do, but this sort of overshadows sort of one of the issues about waste. Once we put something in our trash, it's kind of out of sight, out of mind. And we don't really think about it, right? Because we don't usually see this sort of scenario, but it clearly exists across the United States, clearly exists in Massachusetts, which clearly is not the most populous state. So you can imagine this exists much more higher in very industrial areas, very large states like California and Texas. So we are not immune to these things here in Massachusetts as much as we would like to be. Though one of the things that we do lead in is actually medical waste. Because we have so many damn hospitals and research labs here. Is medical and scientific waste is one of the things Massachusetts actually does lead in. So, fun fact, I've contributed to that narrative a lot myself. I will say, all the science that I've done over the years, I've contributed a lot of scientific waste. So this is hazardous waste. What should we do with our hazardous waste? Well, the reality is, and it's not surprising, this class is all about sustainability. So if we think about waste through sustainability, the best way to handle waste is to produce less of it, right? Right? That's what sustainability tells us, because hazardous waste stems from some sort of raw material. And as with every raw material on this planet, there is a finite amount of it. So given that, the most sustainable thing to do for waste is to find ways to produce less of it and to reuse as much of it as we can. And if we can't do that, do one of two things: convert as much of it as we can to a less hazardous substance, or put the rest in long-term safe storage, like these drums, but not this type of drum, but like actual proper drums, not something out of like a apocalyptic scene. But again, sustainability, we want to think about prevention and reduction of waste. That's the key here, because again, that's what sustainability means. If we're interested in using plastic for the rest of our term as a species, there's only a finite amount of petroleum on the planet. So we're eventually going to have to figure out ways to make that more sustainable if we want future generations to be able to use, say, plastic. Now, the European Union leads the way in this. The United States, frankly, just sucks at it. And that Futurama video I showed you at the beginning really shows you our mindset about trash and waste as a whole. But Denmark does a great job, and Denmark is really good, as is most of the EU, but about 33% of all industrial hazardous waste produced in the EU is actually sold as raw materials for other industry, which is about 3 times as much as it occurs in the United States. So that's what we should do for our hazardous waste. But that's just one aspect of waste, right? We haven't talked about like trash, right? We haven't talked about plastic, right? Food waste, things like that. Hazardous waste is stuff that's like, remember, it's just deadly, right? If you drank a bottle of mercury, you're in trouble. But if you ate a bunch of trash, i.e. what we would call solid waste, you'd probably be okay. So solid waste is a misleading term, because solid waste is basically is the over-encompassing arc of everything that is waste. Solid wastes are anything that can be discarded or thrown away. They can be solid, liquid, or semi-solid, or some sort of containerized gaseous material, which again, it's solid waste, but it doesn't have to be solid to do it, which I always thought was ironic, but that's just the way people that deal with this stuff decided to call it. Now, what is encompassed by solid waste? Well, we talked about industrialized waste, right? Hazardous waste. We talked about sludge from wastewater treatment plants, which is, again, hazardous waste, as is raw sewage and debris from factories and things like that. Those are hazardous waste. So hazardous wastes are a part of solid waste, but solid waste also encompasses what we would typically call municipal words, solid waste, which is the stuff you deal with on an average everyday basis, right? Tomorrow's my garbage day. I'm going to make sure all my garbage and my recyclables are in the things. I'm going to walk that out to the curb. Some guy is going to drive by in a truck, pick it up and throw it away, and then take it to some landfill. That's our solid waste from a municipal setting. And it includes lots of things: cardboard, food, cans, yard waste, e-waste, lots and lots of things. So just remember, solid waste encompasses a lot of things. Hazardous waste is typically solid waste, but most solid waste is not hazardous, right? Your municipal solid waste is not hazardous, right? And that contributes the bulk of the waste that we're going to focus on for the remainder of the class. But I just want to sort of note two things. Now, the United States, very much with hazardous waste, we are the #1 producer of municipal solid waste as well, both in total volume as well as per capita waste. We produce more municipal solid waste than India and China, which have 3 to 4 times the population we do. So we produce a lot of waste. Now, the other thing is, I want to contrast this to nature, is that humans, we generate trash and then we throw it away. But when we contrast to a natural environment, there's no waste. So when a tree falls in my backyard, over the course of several decades, that tree is consumed and broken down, and all the materials of that tree are brought right back into the environment. And that's the same for everything that exists naturally. And so the environment has no waste, right? The environment recycles everything. But when we think about humans, we do very little of that recycling and reusing part. So, as I mentioned, the United States is #1 in total waste and per capita solid waste production globally, with 25% of all solid waste is just produced here in the United States by our 350 million residents, which is awful, for lack of a better word, right? I mean, we're not top producer of plastic waste, which is good, but we produce more solid waste than anywhere else. And again, we produce 25% of all waste globally, which is crazy to think about given how few people we have relative to the world, right? And so when we sort of put this in perspective, it's really staggering numbers. And there's all these things here about, all this waste that we produce. And, we could fill enough garbage trucks to circle the Earth 6 times, right? K-Cups sold in 2013 alone could circle around the globe 10.5 times. Styrofoam, 95 times around the globe. 100 billion plastic bags, which could go to the moon and back 60 times, right? We produce enough carpet and throw away enough carpet in the United States to cover the state of Delaware, right? And probably my favorite one is we produce enough office paper and throw away enough office paper to build an 11-foot wall from New York to San Francisco. So we could build a 3,000-mile wall from San Francisco to New York with just our paper waste, like office paper. So apparently Donald Trump should have been trying to use office paper to build his wall on the southern border, because there was no shortage of it in our landfills. And I'm obviously just joking. But again, just a staggering amount of waste. You're talking about billions of tons of waste. And it is just the United States, which means if the United States produces a quarter, that means there's 3 times as much waste produced by the rest of the planet. So it's a staggering amount of waste everywhere. And it sort of goes back to my little story I told you at the beginning of the plastics lecture, right? Where I would watch these survival shows and they would find plastic waste and trash everywhere they went in these survival shows. Because again, the trash problem is out of control. And I showed you that Futurama video. I mean, I think it's funny. Maybe you didn't find it funny. You don't have the same humor as I do, but it really sort of shows the problem, right? We're very, very wasteful. And as I've shown you, we don't know what the hell to do with all of our waste, which is why taking it and putting it on a rocket and blasting it into space with the money from the New York Mafia or the Italian Mafia in New York isn't that crazy when you think about all the terrible ways we've gone to take care of our waste. So waste is a problem. It's clearly unsustainable. So it goes directly sort of against the things we've been talking about. But waste, as we talked about, can also be very, very toxic, not just to humans, but also to the environment as a whole. And remember, plastic as a compound falls under this category of solid waste as well. So, all the things we talk about plastic apply to today's class as well, which is fun. So let's talk about some interesting types of solid waste containment. So the first is actually CSOs, or combined sewage overflows. And so you'll sort of see we have CSO outflows here all over Massachusetts on the Charles River and the Mystic River. Now, CSOs are basically they're basically like these overflows where wastewater containing untreated human waste, industrial waste, or potentially other debris is carried through all the stormwater pipes and eventually discharged into the Charles River through these CSOs. And so these aren't that common in more modern cities, but you guys have to remember Boston is a very old city. And so these are outdated infrastructure back at a time where we thought it was a good thing to dump waste into our waterways. Clearly not, but that's what we thought as well. Now, these CSOs are not commonly used anymore, but anytime there's a very heavy rain, we commonly see we commonly see these CSOs overflowing to the Charles River, into the Mystic River. So if you've ever been kayaking down the Charles River, there's a good chance, as you sort of see, that you've gone past one of these CSOs. You didn't quite know what it was, but it existed there. And there might be poo-poo or some sort of waste into your Charles River. So just as a note. Now, one other type of waste is actually our e-waste. And this is really taken off in modern times as the computer has proliferated, in particular as smartphones have really proliferated. And e-waste encompasses any electronic device. It could be a computer, it could be a beeper. You know, you guys are probably our own enough to know what that is, but from anyone that knows what a beeper is, that was electronic waste. It could be your smartphone, it could be a regular telephone, it could be a fan, it could be a hard drive, it could be your TV. Anything that has electronic components in it is categorized as e-waste. And the reality is, e-waste, very much like all our other waste, simply is poorly taken care of. And about 14% of all e-waste is recycled globally, which clearly is not enough. Now, where does this e-waste go? Well, it's shipped to a country where labor is very cheap. So I have another video for you guys. It's a Futurama video, but it's very accurate, I promise. So we'll watch this little Futurama blip. It's about a minute or so. It's about e-waste, and it is stupidly accurate. So 2 minutes, we'll watch this.
New York Times online podcast blog comments editor. Mr. Mayor, isn't this e-waste dangerous?
Not at all, Scoop. Not after it's hauled off to the third world by an expendable team of minimum wage nobodies.
Good news, nobodies.
Greetings, my friends. It shan't take long to strip down your clunker.
There's nothing wrong with our clunker.
Really? Because we can smelt out the deadly chromium to make rat poison and artificial sweeteners.
No thanks. We're delivering e-waste.
Petey, we're halfway done.
This thing is 40% chromium.
Gentle now. Gentle with the hover dumpster. Ready for processing.
What smells like bloody sinuses?
We burn your e-waste down to the usable metals, safely releasing the toxins into our air and drinking water.
Ugh, that's the worst thing I've ever seen.
Really? Then don't look over there. Okay, kids, let's play Find the Shiny.
That's even more horrific. Is all the work done by children?
No, not the whipping.
Granted, we later learned some positive things about recycling. But a better solution is to use our electronics as long as possible instead of throwing them out in the first place. I'm going to start by keeping my old cell phone, even if it is outdated.
Hello, Mr. Ranga. Your call to St. Louis has gone through.
Well, let's at least throw this TV out. The batteries in the remote are getting low.
No! Put that back and turn it on.
Scoop check.
So I don't know if you guys ever thought you would learn anything about science and the way we process waste from the creator of The Simpsons, but shockingly accurate. And it's meant to be funny and all that stuff, but shockingly accurate as the way we handle e-waste. Because again, it's shipped to countries where labor is cheap. Oftentimes it's forced labor. And they remove valuable metals, most commonly by burning them, burning the plastic away, and getting all the shiny parts, right? Find the shiny, right? That's as terrible as that was. But that's the reality of e-waste. It's a poorly handled, but an increasingly important part of our society. And the sort of the final thing I'll say about that video is, you know, the Leela, who's the Cyclops, the one with one eyes, really says what we have to do with e-waste, right? Is trying to use our electronics longer, right? Trying to generate less electronic waste. So that's our friend e-waste, anything electronic. And you can sort of see this is a wide variety of interesting looking technological items from the 90s, right? Some pretty sweet printers and stuff like that. So e-waste is a lot. And sort of the final thing I'll say about e-waste is not supposed to be thrown away in like a regular old landfill in the United States and Europe and a few other countries. It's banned from landfills because of the relatively toxic metals that they contain. So you should always try to personally, if you're going to throw something away, try to sell it, try to bring it to something like Best Buy to reuse your piece of electronic waste. So those are the sort of the different types of electronic waste. Now, what do we do with them? And again, it comes down to a simple one-word answer. One-word answer: we bury. Right? We bury our solid waste very much the way we bury our hazardous waste. And why is that? It's dirt cheap to do. And I didn't mean that to be a pun or anything, because we're burying stuff in soil, but that's the reality of waste. Out of sight, out of mind. And the cheapest thing is to hire a guy with a little excavator here, dig a hole, dump the waste in, and cover it out. And so, for any of you that have been to a landfill, at least here in the United States, the way we do our landfills here, and this is not true elsewhere, but here in the United States, as well as in Europe too, waste are generally spread relatively evenly on a layer of dirt, and they're covered either by a layer of clay, of plastic foam, to keep the waste dry, to reduce leakages of contaminated water, lowering the risk of fire, decreasing odors, and reducing accessibility to rodents. And you might ask yourself, how can waste be set on fire? Well, remember, food waste, which is a huge part of our solid waste that we bury, as it breaks down, it produces methane. Now remember, methane is just natural gas, and so it's extremely flammable. So commonly you'll see landfills catch on fire if they're not tended to properly because of all the methane produced in these landfills. But this is what we do here in the United States. We try to bury our waste, we cover it daily, try to minimize the problems with it. But again, it's really out of sight, out of mind. Now, there are some companies. So for instance, for those of you guys that are here in Massachusetts and you have, what's the green garbage truck people? What are they called? Whatever the green garbage truck people that service most of Massachusetts for garbage, they actually do the same thing. They bury things, but they actually use these little pipes to collect methane gas, so natural gas, and then they use it in their factories to essentially combust for energy. And so they say they're being greener by capturing methane, but they actually simply do not. Yes, thank you, Megan. It is Waste Management. That's the name of the company here in Massachusetts that does this. So they capture methane from their landfills, use it, they burn it as natural gas to power their factories and stuff like that. Thank you, Megan. I can never remember their name, even though I see them drive by once a week at my house. So that's what's most commonly what we do. But the reality is a huge part of the planet actually uses just open dumps. And again, this looks like a scene out of apocalypse, an apocalyptic movie, right? But this is really, really common in large parts of the planet, whether it's in Africa, Southeast Asia, Central and South America. This is pretty common, and it's just an open dump. It's just a field or a pit of garbage. If you watched the Plastic Ocean documentary, you saw what this looks like firsthand. It's really, really sad to look at, but they're just really, really giant piles of garbage. And clearly this poses a couple problems. Now, the first is, it probably stinks, which is probably an understatement. It probably is awful there. The second issue is there's all sorts of issues with health problems. You can imagine rooting around garbage, as these gentlemen are doing, is a bad thing for your health, and you would be absolutely right. But you also probably recognize that this one is on fire. And again, that's all the methane being produced, which catches on fire. And you can imagine inhaling smoke from burning plastic or burning computer parts or burning whatever is not good for your lungs. And you'd be absolutely right? This is really, really bad for human health, like really bad. But there's also pretty severe social issues. These happen in very poor areas where they simply don't have access to doing things like this to protect themselves. So burying solid waste, again, comes in two forms. This is by far the most common on the planet because, again, most of the planet exists in poverty. So kind of an unfortunate thing that we do. Now, another common thing we do is actually here in the United States, and it's relatively common in Europe as well, in China. We have what is called waste-to-energy incinerators. So as you saw previously, we have about 9 of these in Massachusetts. Basically, they just take extreme heat, burn trash, and they get energy from it, which accounts for about 9% of all municipal waste here in the United States. The reality is landfills, while they seem like a better thing than burning trash, landfills actually emit more pollutants than these waste-to-energy incinerators, which is, from a climate change perspective, is good, but from a health perspective, waste-to-energy incinerators are better for health and things like that as well. However, you can imagine if you burn stuff, there's ash. And so this incinerator ash is, as you can imagine, very toxic, right? And so what to do with that ash is a problem, right? Because if you burn a monstrous pile of garbage, you're still going to have thousands of pounds of ash. And what do you do with that? And given our current stance of things, we just bury it again, right? And so while waste energy incinerators are great, they do have their problems, right? Burning trash also contributes to climate change as well. But unlike most things with our waste, they do not let people recycle, so it contributes to the lack of sustainability in the way we handle our waste as well. So those are all the ways we handle our waste. I hope the picture wasn't too grim, though I think it does well on its own to be pretty dang grim, because as the sort of the clip I showed you at the beginning of the class, we're very wasteful, not just here, but globally. And how we handle our waste is, for lack of another way to say it, just really crappy. We're just bad at it. So what should we do? Right? How do we reduce our waste? Well, what we normally do right now is we bury most of it, we recycle some of it, we incinerate some of it, and we use very little reduce and reusing. So we have this reverse funnel system here, right? So basically like a pyramid scheme, but upside down, right? And so that's what we do. But what we should really do is what we do here on the left. Reducing and reusing should be the top two things. And then recycling, and very little of what we do should be burned and buried, because again, there's lots of issues with burying and incinerating our trash. Very little issues, environmentally speaking, of course. I'm not talking about the cost of businesses or anything like that to do these things, but very little environmental or sustainability issues by doing these top three. So again, we should take our system, turn it on its head, making reducing, reusing, and recycling much, the 3 R's, being much better overall. So that's where we're at. This is what we should aim to be. So what are some of the things we do? Now, I've linked this article here from NPR. It's about National Sword. Now, National Sword is a recycling company that heavily relied on China for the processing of recycling. Now, many of you probably know recycling, while you probably do it, is not a very profitable business at this point in time. Now, part of the reason of that is the infrastructure is not quite there, and the same way, like not a lot of funding publicly is there for recycling. And it depends on where you are as well, of course. But the other problem with recycling is it's more expensive to buy recycled materials than it is to buy brand new plastic or brand new metal or anything like that. So there's this really big economic disconnect between recycling and buying new stuff, because buying new stuff is just cheaper at this given time. And so if you have a couple minutes, this article from NPR, which is my favorite news source. If you don't like NPR, you should like it because it's awesome. But NPR about sword recycling and what's happening because China is accepting less and less and essentially zero recycling from the United States. And what is the United States as a country going to do, or Europe as a set of nations going to do with their recycling, given, again, the lack of a financial incentive to recycle versus buying brand new stuff. So definitely take a peek at this article. It's a pretty cool article, sort of talks about the issues with recycling. Now, as we sort of talked about e-waste, there's really, really awful side effects of recycling e-waste. Remember, they're processed by low income, sometimes forced labor, and there's lots and lots of toxic chemicals, as you again saw from the Futurama clip. So I won't talk about this because again, it's already gone through. But just to put this into perspective, I can never remember how to say this nation, but 82% of children in this nation actually suffer, less than 6 years old, actually suffer from some form of lead poisoning. Why is that? Well, recycling e-waste. So that's the reality of e-waste. We do a really bad job of e-waste, but there are ways to recycle e-waste. Now, one of the things that's been proposed is to actually force, here in the United States, and Europe does this to an extent, to force manufacturers to take back their electronic waste, right? So if you buy a phone from Apple, the idea being is when you're done with that phone, you would ship that phone to Apple, and Apple would be forced to recycle its materials and reuse those materials. And so that that's a really great solution, which is what we would call e-cycle, one of the aspects of e-cycling. But there are lots of people who are trying to start industries based upon recycling of electronic waste. But the reality is the United States already produces a crap ton, 50% of all the world's e-waste, and recycles only a small fraction of what they produce. So we're sort of in a dire state here. If you want to get a new phone, thinking about trying to not throw it away, right? Trying to sell it, trying to give it to someone so it gets a second life before it is relegated to e-waste. Because right now, e-waste is not best thing. Again, really hard to do. And again, oftentimes done by really poor places of the world. Now, the other thing I'll make mention is, economic opportunities are not just found in e-waste. There's the potential for economic opportunities elsewhere, right? And so for those of you that, if you say get your first apartment or a house or whatever, there's lots of money to be made and saved by reusing and reusing old materials. So there's an entire sector of our economy. It's not huge right now, but it's around reclaiming and upcycling wood. So they get old dilapidated wood like this, they refinish it, they make cool things like tables and reusable wood for houses and things like that. So there are economic activities around that, but there's also the capacity to save money by, say, going to OfferUp or Craigslist or This Vintage Town to buy things. You're also starting to see like clothing consignment come as a big thing. So when I watch Hulu, for instance, I'm actually I see commercials for The Real, which is a clothing recycling company. You sell high-end clothes to them, and then they sell it to people. Again, giving these ideas, giving these clothing, giving these items a second life. And that's sort of one of the big things, right? Is there an economic opportunity to be made from our waste? Yes. So we should probably do it. And if there's a way to make money off something, you can guarantee that someone's probably figured out a way to monetize it. Now, the reality is, even if we figure out ways to reuse our waste, the reality is we're still in a dire state, right? We still produce more waste than we should. So the reality is, if we're going to think about waste sustainably, we need to mimic nature, right? When we mimic nature, there's a fancy term for it. It's called biomimicry. But biomimicry, or just mimicking what nature does, is a really key component of sustainability, right? Because nature is zero waste. Right? Nature, when a tree dies, remember, it's all recycled back into nature. There is no waste. And so that's the mantra we should really adopt, right? Reusing and recycling things and chemicals. And if say a factory that builds computer chips can't do that, they can't reuse their stuff, well, we should try to figure out a way to repurpose their materials and develop what we'll call an industrial ecosystem. So let's look at what nature does, right? So nature, it's its own little ecosystem, right? All these things interact with another. This, the monkey eats the snake and the grasshopper, but when the monkey dies, it gets eaten by the vulture, right? So nature is this ever-connected thing, but we can apply this idea of the interconnected waste network to a town or a city, where we have the center's electrical power plant. It produces waste heat, ash, as well as calcium sulfate waste, and those things can be repurposed by other factories, other processes in the area, right? Waste heat can be used to heat a fish farm, right? Or power a pharmaceutical plant or a greenhouse, right? Waste can always be repurposed, but there has to be the financial incentive to repurpose it. Because right now, remember, it's way cheaper to just take your trash and dump it in a landfill. And that's the sort of reality we live in now. And these industrial ecosystems are pretty dang cool, mostly in concept, though they do exist in a couple places, and I'll show you in just a moment. But they do reduce the cost. Managing waste, as I sort of have made mention to in the plastics class, is a huge cost to businesses. Remember, Carnival Cruise Line was fined $20 million for dumping waste into the ocean. But that $20 million was only a small fraction of what it actually costs to handle most of their waste. So processing waste is expensive. Handling waste is expensive. And if you can potentially monetize it, i.e. via an industrial ecosystem, companies can reduce their bottom line, which, as you guys probably all know, they love to do whatever way they can. But it also reduces the potential for lawsuits, right? If you recycle your waste or reuse it, it means less likely to make it into the environment, which means you're less likely to be sued by a state or the EPA or something like that. It also improves the health and safety of surrounding areas, also of your workers, because again, less toxic stuff making it out into the environment and to your workers. And the final thing it does, it also encourages innovation. If there's a problem, problems encourage innovation. allowing people to potentially find substitutes for resource-intensive projects, which we've seen over and over and again. So what does one of these industrial parks potentially look like? Well, this is one of the the Intervale Eco Park in Burlington, Vermont. If you've ever been to Burlington, Vermont, it's a wonderful city. It's in Vermont, so it's like Vermont-y, so there's woods and Vermont stuff, but it's a really awesome city. But at this place, they have a really awesome eco park where they have a farm connected to a chicken producer, connected to a brewery, and they're all connected. So our farm produces straw as an input, where there's storage and wetting and composting, which can be used to then grow mushrooms and other things, and including aquaculture. And then they have chickens that take advantage of the straw for bedding. And then they have the brewery produces spent grain. You're thinking about like hops and things like that, rye, that then can be used to again compost and then feed mushrooms. So again, the brewery and the chicken broiler and the farm would produce a lot of waste on their own, but again, they can combine their waste, do other things with it, and then turn their waste products into products, mushrooms, worms, salad, so on and so forth. So again, really cool thing in Vermont. Again, a great way for an industrial park. That's surrounding a farm, but we can look at something like in Kalundborg, Denmark. Probably not right. As I mentioned, Danish is really a hard language. But you see they have this power station where they get oil, they get gas and cooling and waste utility water from a refinery. They produce steam that goes back to the refinery. They give all their waste heat, their sludge. And again, producing all these things. And again, normally they would just be thrown away in some way, shape, or form. But again, recycling all this stuff allows us to produce zero net waste as best we can. So what are the takeaways from today's class? Well, we are really bad at waste. Right, the way we handle waste right now is very, very unsustainable, and we throw away too much. And the way we handle our waste is very, very bad. And it shouldn't surprise you that the way we handle our waste, again, is the cheapest way to handle our waste, which is unfortunate, but the reality of capitalism as an economic system, right? But the reality is, as good as we can get it with storing our waste, the biggest thing is just to reducing how much waste we produce, right? Because again, there's a limited amount of every material on this planet. And so eventually we're going to run out of petroleum. Eventually we're going to run out of fresh water and so on and so forth. And it's eventually going to become a part where we should have done this, as opposed to let's do it now so we don't get to the point where we essentially tragedy the commons most of our ways of getting raw materials or storing waste. And I usually have a slide here about what you can do. The reality is, fixing our waste problem is a political sort of issue, right? We need to change the way we enforce our laws about pollution. We need to change the way we enforce our laws about the way waste is done, right? We need to force innovation. We need to fund better recycling programs and e-waste programs. That's the reality of these things, right? We need to find better ways to enforce the laws on the book and strengthen our laws and encourage and potentially force for those that don't want to comply with better laws into getting better laws for ourselves, right? Because as we saw with Flint, Michigan, right, toxic waste affects millions of people, right? Not just here in the United States, but also abroad as we're handling our waste and things like that. So we're in a sort of a bad state, but as with all things, with climate change, with the plastic problem, as we'll see with the food problem, there's always a way to do it, and it requires policy level changes. Now, you of course can change the way you do your pollution, right? You can minimize how much electronic waste you do, try to recycle things better, and so on and so forth. But the reality is we need better policy to handle this problem, because like plastic, it is an enormous problem that requires policy. So that is going to be it for the day. I'm going to stop recording here.